On March 4th in 1861, on the eve of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln delivered his first inaugural address. Now, at the time, Lincoln, and even throughout his presidency, Lincoln was not a popular president most of the time. And when he delivered this address, he certainly wasn't. He was disliked by a lot of the people in the country. He was mistrusted. A lot of the people in his own party, the Republican Party at that time, viewed him as a crude country bumpkin lawyer. He was unlikable and unreliable. A lot of people in the South viewed him as a despot, and others in parts of the country viewed him as sort of a weakling who could be manipulated and used by other people. And so the immediate result of his election was really to further divide a nation that was already divided. And in practical terms, speaking practically, his speech that day, in almost every respect, was a total failure. His entire speech was an appeal for the restoration of trust. And so he speaks directly to Southerners. He tries to reassure them that the government will not threaten their peace, their property, or their personal security. Now think about that when Lincoln says that they won't threaten their property, because part of that property were slaves. And he insists that as president, he can't do anything legally to interfere with slavery in the southern states, and that he had no desire to do so, even if he could. Now, a lot of people don't understand that Abe Lincoln was not a perfect person. We sort of put him up on a pedestal, but as I've said before, we need to take these people off pedestals and see them exactly for who they are. And so he even reiterated his support of the fugitive slave law at the time, which meant that if a slave ran away, there was a bounty on their head and they could be caught and forcefully brought back to their owner. Like a lawyer speaking to a jury, he said that separation between the areas, the Confederacy and the Union, would make the nation's current problems worse, not better. He says, physically speaking, we cannot separate. And then he proposes that in a democracy, the ultimate wisdom of the people can be trusted to prevail. And he reminds those who oppose his administration that even bad governments have limited powers and limited terms of office. He goes on to say that both North and South profess to be content with the Union if all constitutional rights can be maintained, and he pledges again that all those rights will be maintained. He says nothing valuable can be lost by taking time. But then he closes by appealing to our bonds of affection, he says, which are rooted in the mystic chords of memory. And finally, at the end of his speech, he says, I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. For Lincoln, 1861 wasn't a great year for the better angels of our nature. And yet that phrase has come to be one that we hear often. We revere it, you know. Just where did that phrase come from, though? And what do we mean when we appeal to those supposed better angels of our nature? The phrase is one it's much older than Lincoln. He didn't coin it. He didn't start that phrase, but we do know that he personally wrote it into the text of his speech. His Secretary of State, William Seward, had, I guess they worked on it together, but William Seward had written it down. And William Seward told him that he should use the phrase, the guardian angel of the nation, but Lincoln scratched that out and put in the better angels of our nature on his own. The better angels of our nature as a phrase seems to have originated, and I just learned this myself as I researched it, as many of those words and phrases that we use commonly today, with that wizard of wordsmiths, the Bard of Avon, William Shakespeare, in his play Othello, which was written in the 1600s, the early 1600s. In that play, maybe you know it, Othello has murdered his wife Desdemona, accusing her of adultery. And her uncle Gratiano declares that it's good that Desdemona's father, Brabantio, is dead. Because he says, "Poor Desdemona, I am glad thy father's dead. Thy match was mortal to him, and pure grief shore his old thread in twain. Did he live now, this sight would make him do a desperate turn, yea, curse his better angel from his side, and fall to reprobation." In other words, Desdemona's father didn't like the fact that she had married Othello to begin with, and that if he'd been alive when she was killed, he would have stopped listening to his better angel, killed Othello, and been damned to hell. And then in his sonnet number 144, Shakespeare also tells us of two spirits that are both from me, a better angel that is right fair, and a worser spirit that tempteth my better angel from my side, and thus would corrupt my saint to be a devil. If you think about that, what he's saying there, and maybe you remember the image that we grew up with in cartoons and in comic books, right? Of a small angel sitting on the right shoulder of someone, and then the fallen angel, usually like a little devil, sitting on the left shoulder, and they argue back and forth. You know, the good angel on this side is trying to get you to do the right thing all the time and whispering in your ear, "Don't do that, don't do this." And the little angel, the demon angel over here saying, "Don't listen to that guy." Usually they make him talk like a guy from Brooklyn. I don't know why. "Don't listen to that guy. Do this instead. You'll have more fun." You remember that. But over the centuries, this idea of better angels was used by other writers and poets and orators in appealing to the more admirable traits and temperament that we all strive to exhibit, or that we try to anyway. In a book written in 1715 by Nicholas Rowe titled "The Tragedy of Lady Jane Grey," we learn that we need our better angels to help us participate in friendship's hour and friendship's office, he says. He says this, he says, "To come when counsel and when help for others is wanting, to share the pain of every gnawing care, to speak of comfort in the time of trouble, to reach a hand and save thee from adversity." And in a sermon from 1837, the Reverend William Ewell warns his congregation. He says, "We not only refuse to listen to our better angel, but we drive him from us with mocks and insults. We plunge willingly into the slough of selfishness and refuse to pass onwards." And in 1851, Reverend Frederick Huntington, who actually began as a Unitarian minister, but went on to become a well-known Episcopalian minister, he preached a sermon in Cambridge, Massachusetts, following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which he opposed. He said that it was a national sin, the Fugitive Slave Act. He says, "With every wanton denial of our purer aspirations, those aspirations themselves grow faint. Resistance to our better angels drives those angels away." So you know how we talk about we push people away by our actions and by our words? That's what he's saying there happens with those better angels of our nature when we don't listen to them, when we resist them. Now, it's possible that Lincoln may have heard that sermon by him, because a lot of times back then sermons were printed in newspapers and they were put out in pamphlets. And if you criticized the government, certainly that sermon would be printed. And over the years, the idea of better angels was also used to describe people, usually women. As when a poet in London in 1761 says, "Wives our better angels are. Wives are our better angels. I know that's true for me anyway. And Lisa's not here. I'm not trying to impress her. She can't be here today. So I'm telling you the truth. And of course, they've also been viewed over the years as well as angels, those supernatural beings that we read about in sacred books and stories. But the primary use has long been to describe our character traits and the desires that are good and worthy of us. Even Charles Dickens refers to them in his book Barnaby Rudge, when he writes, "So do the shadows of our own desires stand between us and our better angels, and thus their brightness is eclipsed." Increasingly today, though, we hear politicians speak of the better angels of our nature, and other people, the pundits on TV. In fact, one of my favorites, the author and the historian John Meacham, his latest book is titled "The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels." I haven't read it yet. I hope to soon. So what are we to make of this idea of our better angels? The word angel originally comes from the Greek word angelos, and it literally means a messenger or an envoy, one that announces something. So an angelos, a messenger in ancient times, could be a human being, but more often we think of them as the messengers like the one in the Bible, Gabriel, who tells Mary and Joseph that she's going to have a baby. Or in the Quran, when Gabriel, known as Jibril in the Quran, announces to Muhammad that he must recite the Quran. And what he does is he grabs Muhammad and he squeezes him and forces the Quran out of him. It's highly unlikely that any of us are going to be visited by any of those kind of angels in the near future. At least I don't expect to be. But you never know. Angels unawares, right? You never know. But let's think of it this way. We are all called to be angels. We're called to be messengers to those around us, to our communities, and to the world. And especially now, the message that we have to carry should be one of healing and hope and peace and love, but not in some Pollyanna-ish way. We're hearing an awful lot of talk about unity and healing right now, and that's okay. Much of it we're hearing, though, from the same people who caused much of the same disunity and pain over the past few years. Healing and hope and peace and love don't come without work, and not without some pain, and not without some deep inner work on ourselves as well. It's easy for us, at least for some of us, I know it is for me, to point the finger at those other people that I disagree with and tell them how wrong they are. It's not easy, though, for me to look at myself, to consider where I may not be listening to my better angels, to those better angels of my nature. You know, we're all familiar with the words, perhaps, of Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, when he says this. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you can see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Jesus was a carpenter. He grew up as a carpenter. His father was a carpenter. And it's likely that he was using what he learned from his father. When you get a speck of sawdust in your eye, you have to take it out. But don't do that. I mean, do that first before you try to take one out of your brother's eye. And just what does it mean in that phrase, the better angels of our nature? In Shakespeare's day and before, there was considerable debate about the nature of human beings. Some thought that humans were basically a mixture of good and evil. Others, though, believed that humans were, in the words of John Calvin, the Swiss theologian, that they were totally depraved. In fact, one of the tenets of the faith in the tradition that I grew up in, it says that because Adam and Eve sinned, all human beings, quote, and this is a direct quote, have become sinners, totally depraved, and as such are justly exposed to the wrath of God. Totally depraved. No hope. John Calvin carried that idea to the extreme when he said that the only people who were saved were the ones that God chose to be saved or predestined for salvation, and that everyone else, no matter how good a life you've led, were going to hell. There were some people who were picked for salvation and others who weren't. To which I always ask, then why did he bother to make us? Makes no sense. In our liberal tradition, though, we believe the opposite. We understand that human nature is complex. Rather than original sin, though, we believe that people are born in what the author and the ex-Catholic priest, because he was kicked out, Matthew Fox, called original blessing. Or in the words of our first principle, that all human beings have inherent worth and dignity, not because it's something bestowed on them by a deity out there somewhere, but simply because they're human beings. The Buddha taught that it's a blessing to be born as a human. And so that we could appreciate it, he gave us what he called the Eightfold Noble Path. Oh, I'm sorry, the Noble Eightfold Path to live by. He said those 8 principles in that path is right understanding, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and right effort. And there's a lot to unpack there, but you get the main gist. Maybe there's a sermon series on those in the future. I don't know. And in the Apostle Paul's letter to the followers of Jesus in Philippi, he writes these words. He says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. Or in the modern version called The Message that I prefer, it says, summing it all up, friends, I'd say you'll do best by filling your minds and meditating on things that are true, noble, reputable, authentic, compelling, gracious, the best, not the worst, the beautiful, not the ugly, things to praise, not things to curse. These better angels of our nature are the things that give not only ourselves joy and peace, but bring healing and unity that we're looking for in our nation today and in the world. And to be sure, this isn't easy. We can't ignore the problems that have been created, and they're going to take time to solve. Difficult work lies ahead for all of us, but it's work that has to be done nonetheless. When Lincoln used those words, the nation was on the brink of falling apart. In fact, within a month, civil war broke out, and those better angels gave way to the fallen angels of fear and hatred and racism, resulting in one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. I don't think it's over the top or hyperbolic to say that we are standing on a similar brink again today. So let's work and put our effort into ensuring that the better angels of our nature are the ones that prevail in the coming days ahead. Our task as individuals and together is not only to listen to those better angels, those messenger of truth and nobility and good repute and authenticity and graciousness, but to be those angels in our everyday lives. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.